Jerry Jones has his new yes man, Brian Schottenheimer. After firing Mike McCarthy and looking for a new head coach, it's the guy who is right under the Cowboys' nose as the offensive coordinator. He'll be tasked with actually trying to have the Cowboys live up to expectations, which they haven't done all century, and get Dak Prescott back on track, who apparently really likes Schottenheimer. He's been around the block and bounced around. You might even remember his dad, but now it's time to prove that he can be an NFL head coach, and he has the experience. It's just the matter of whether or not the experience was good or not. I'm not gonna lie, I was a little surprised when I saw that they had hired Brian Schottenheimer. Jerry Jones just seems like a guy who I think probably would have wanted to go an entire different direction, and going with a guy that's already been on the staff, been under Mike McCarthy for the last few years, it was kind of surprising to see him there. I also don't think Brian Schottenheimer is a guy who has had a ton of success to be really considered a good NFL head coach candidate. There are some really good guys out there who are young and leading really good offenses or even defensive masterminds. And Brian Schottenheimer has had a lot of offenses who have had a lot of issues that weren't really his fault. It was just crazy things going on around him. But because of that, he hasn't had a ton of really good offenses. You know, I think he did a good job with the Jets. And other than that, he's had a ton of injuries on his offenses and hasn't been able to put out full teams of healthy guys. And it's hard to really evaluate him. And at the end of the day, I don't think Jerry really cares. I think Jerry wants a guy who's going to say yes. Jerry wants a guy who's going to do what he asks of him. If he wants certain guys out there, Jerry's going to get what Jerry wants. And that was the problem with Mike McCarthy. That was the problem with Jason Garrett, is that these coaches are going to have a really hard time actually succeeding when the real guy calling the shot is the owner. It's Jerry Jones. Jerry Jones is calling the shots. But with a really good head coach, the Cowboys can still overcome that. And the question then becomes, is Brian Schottenheimer a really good coach? Brian Schottenheimer is a familiar name for many reasons. He's been around for a while on a lot of different teams, but his dad is also Marty Schottenheimer, who was the head coach for, a lot of different teams: the Browns, Chiefs, Redskins, and Chargers. He was just a football guy. He played so long ago that he won an AFL championship. He played for the Boston Patriots. He actually is the only eligible NFL coach without 200 career wins, not in the Hall of Fame, probably because he never made a Super Bowl, but did get to 2 AFC championship games. He has had a lot of former assistant coaches go on to become head coaches, like Bill Cowher, Tony Dungy, even Bruce Arians, all guys who won Super Bowls. But I think that Brian Schottenheimer is his favorite assistant. He was a good high school quarterback at Blue Valley in Overland Park, Kansas, got his school to a state championship and was a first-team All-State and an All-American honorable mention. He ended up going to Kansas on a scholarship and then transferred to play at Florida to play for Steve Spurrier. He backed up Danny Werfel there. After he graduated in 1997, he got into coaching and was an assistant at a bunch of spots like the Rams, Chiefs, Syracuse, USC. Then he became a quarterbacks coach with the Redskins and then the Chargers. You can probably do the math. Yes, some of those jobs were under his dad, but he still proved himself. He was the offense coordinator for the Jets for a while. He helped Chad Pennington win Comeback Player of the Year, led a great offense with Brett Favre, and got the Jets to back-to-back AFC titles with Mark Sanchez at quarterback. He was in talks to get the Jets head coach job and even the Dolphins head coach job after Nick Saban left, but obviously none of those worked out. He had to keep grinding his way to the top. He was the Rams offensive coordinator under Jeff Fisher, and the offense really did struggle. It was ranked 25th in 2012, 21st in 2013, and 28th in 2014. It wasn't great, but injuries to Sam Bradford really didn't help. He briefly went back to the college level and was the OC at Georgia under Mark Reich, but wasn't retained when Kirby Smart took over. He then became the offensive coordinator for the Seahawks and had a lot of success. The rushing offense was great and Russell Wilson played really well, but then it went south at the end of 2020 and he was fired. He spent a year as the passing game coordinator for that disastrous Urban Meyer Jaguars team and then wasn't retained when Doug Peterson took over. That takes us to his time with the Cowboys, one that led to him becoming the head coach. He was originally hired as a consultant and would break down opposing offenses with defensive coordinator Dan Quinn. Then he became the offensive coordinator and did have some struggles, but a lot of that did just come without a healthy Dak Prescott. Clearly, Jerry Jones liked him enough to give him the reins to America's team. And now he's the one calling the shots, at least when Jerry lets him. Brian Schottenheimer really hasn't had the most incredible journey, but he is a guy with a ton of experience. He's done a decent job with the Cowboys when you see what they've done mostly with Cooper Rush when Dak Prescott has been injured. I think he's done a good job, but the question still stands, what if Dak was really playing? It's hard to truly evaluate him without that starting quarterback actually on the field and playing well. And it even goes back so much further than that. You go back to the Rams and Sam Bradford constantly getting hurt, making it really, really hard to evaluate him. But he has had some good years, but those Jets years were a long time ago, and he was kind of the scapegoat there at the end, but truly, he did a really good job, I think, earlier in those Jets years. When I remember watching those teams, I was always impressed at Mark Sanchez and how he played. Of course, those teams are remembered for how good the defense was, but it's also important. The offense was solid, and Brian Schottenheimer was the one calling the shots, and Mark Sanchez, after Schottenheimer, clearly wasn't very good. I'm sure he's learned a lot over his years. I'm sure being on that Jag staff with Urban Meyer taught him a perfect example of what not to do, but it really does make me question, his experience and how he's been over the last handful of years. I could be dead wrong. He could be a fantastic hire. He could be an offensive mastermind. I just personally haven't seen it, and that's really not even his fault. And maybe I just have a bad taste in my mouth. I remember Marty Schottenheimer a little bit. I really know his time that 1 year with Washington and some of his other times around the league, and maybe that's just the way I view it, because to me, Brian Schottenheimer has always just been Marty's son. Honestly, I hope I'm right. I don't really care for the Cowboys as a Washington fan, but maybe it's a home run hire. I don't know. I just think when you look down the list of his journey to get where he is, I'm not super impressed. Jerry Jones really isn't a guy who has been super trigger happy with head coaches for a long time now. I can only really remember 3 in my entire lifetime. Bill Parcells was there for a little bit and was pretty mid at the end of his career, and I don't even remember that at all. But I remember a bit of Wade Phillips, who came right after that for a quick 4-year stretch, won the NFC East twice and won a playoff game, but that was it. He had a terrible 1-7 start in 2010, and then he got fired. The first Cowboys coach to ever get fired during a season. Then the Cowboys hired Jason Garrett, the clapping man himself, who I despised for most of my life personally. He was there for what felt like forever, 10 years. He had some good years. He won the NFC East twice, even won a Coach of the Year during that Dak Prescott and Ezekiel Elliott magical rookie season in 2016, but he only won 2 playoff games there. And finally, it was just time to move on, and Jerry Jones went with Mike McCarthy. He had already proven himself. He won a Super Bowl coaching Aaron Rodgers with the Packers. It was a good thought, but 5 years later, and he's already gone. McCarthy won 2 NFC East titles, only 1 playoff game, and just like the other coaches they've had, just simply not enough. And I wouldn't be surprised if it's the same case with Schottenheimer. And really, at some point, it comes back to ownership. With how overbearing Jerry Jones is, I feel like it is a little surprising that he hasn't, gone out and fired coaches very often. But maybe that's just because he does find a yes man and kind of likes him. I think Jason Garrett was the perfect example of that. Jason Garrett would do whatever Jerry wanted. And I think that's a big reason why the Cowboys haven't had a ton of success. You look at certain teams that have success, others that don't. It so often comes down to ownership. In order to win, you either have to have good ownership or literal generational players around that. I think of Peyton Manning with the Colts and how fast he was able to turn them around. Even Joe Burrow getting to that Super Bowl with the Bengals. I think those are bad ownership groups, but I think that the generational player around there was just good enough where that was okay. The problem with Dallas is that I think ownership's a problem. And at the same time, they don't have that generational player. Dak Prescott, I think, is a fine NFL quarterback. He's good, but that's it. He's not truly elite. He's not one of your top 5 guys. He maybe squeaks into the top 10, and that makes it hard to be that good because he's not a generational player, and it's not his job to drag the Cowboys all the way there. At some point, it falls on Jerry Jones, and people have known that for a long time now, but Mike McCarthy figured that out, and even in Green Bay, you could really argue that he was kind of dragged by Aaron Rodgers. Then in Dallas, it just wasn't enough. Again, injuries really didn't help. I think those Dak injuries really derailed some really good seasons, but Mike McCarthy didn't have a lot of success, and I don't think that's a mystery. I think it comes back to ownership, and that's why, for the biggest reason, I think Brian Schottenheimer is going to have a tough time succeeding. But the way around that is to just have a ton of talent. And Dallas does at some points. The good news is that Brian Schottenheimer obviously already knows the roster well, and the key guys, especially when it comes to the offense. In theory, it should be easy for the Cowboys to bounce back and perform better next year with how many key guys landed on injured reserve. Just to end the year, they had Dak Prescott, CeeDee Lamb, Zach Barton, DeMarcus Lawrence, and Trayvon Diggs all on IR. I mean, that's obviously not ideal. It's hard to perform well when there are that many good pieces out. The offensive line's mid. but, you know, it's the least of the worries. Rico Dowdle was fine at running back, but it could be better. And Dallas could really use some more weapons behind just CD. You know, they have Jake Ferguson at tight end. As for the defense, it's really hard to lose a guy like Dan Quinn who was running it, and there's some big-time guys still there and are healthy, like Micah Parsons and Deron Bland, and I bet the Cowboys' new defense coordinator is going to get the best out of him, and that's Matt Eberflus. He failed as the Bears coach and got fired in the middle of his third season after a 4-8 start, but now he gets to just focus on the defense. It's worth remembering how good he was as the Colts DC. That's why he even got a head coaching job. He also already knows Dallas. He coached there from 2011 to 2017 as the linebackers coach. He's going to be a perfect part of the staff for Schottenheimer. I think the Cowboys are a good team. They're a talented roster, but they might be falling behind the 8 ball. I mean, you look at the Eagles. The Eagles, I think, might be the most talented team in the entire NFL, and that's that same division. You know, it's hard to beat the Eagles with that roster that they have there. They're loaded, offense, defense, just everywhere. The Eagles have it. And then you look at Washington, kind of on this come up. New ownership who's finally kind of getting the job done after they were a joke with Dallas for so long. You know, you think about how bad Dan Snyder and Jerry Jones were. Those two were maybe the worst owners there for a long time. They were awful. Snyder was even worse, and now he's gone, and all of a sudden, Washington's on the come up. They have a lot of cap room. They have a good rookie quarterback. The only saving grace for Dallas is that the Giants are absolutely terrible, and so even with how bad the Giants are, the Cowboys will probably really not finish 4th in the division anytime soon. But it's only getting harder every year for the Cowboys. First and foremost, Dak needs to stay healthy, but even past Dak, I think CeeDee Lamb is fantastic, but what else is behind CeeDee Lamb? You know, I think a lot of people think Jake Ferguson. Jake Ferguson's fine. I have no problem with Jake Ferguson, but they need more talent on that offense. They need to shape up that offensive line. You know, remember that 2016 team that was so good with Dak and Zeke? The biggest part of that team, I think, was the offensive line. They were so good in the trenches. Those days are gone. The Cowboys struggle in the trenches now. They're not awful, but they're not good. And it's going to be really hard to succeed, especially with a quarterback who I don't think is overly elite like Dak in those kind of circumstances. The defense has been really plagued by injuries too, and I still think the defense is fantastic. Dan Quinn did a great job. I think Matt Eberflus is a A++ hire for that spot. I think he's a great coach. I think he's going to do a fantastic job, and good for him. He gets to coach some really, really good players. I mean, they are absolutely loaded on that defense, and I think if Dallas can be a good team next year and even going forward, it's going to be because of that defense. I mean, you look at the guys on there, Trayvon Diggs and Deron Bland out in that secondary. You look really in, and of course, Micah Parsons is always the guy that's going to be the first guy to stand out, but Dallas is just loaded at defense, and I think that's going to be the key for them going forward, because I don't think Dak's good enough to drag an offense all the way. That really makes Brian Schottenheimer the X factor. If he can be a really good coach, if he can be a really good offensive mastermind, put this team together, then the Cowboys could be pretty good after all. I'm just not betting on that. I think we might be looking at another yes man. I don't necessarily love the hire if I was a big Cowboys fan. I think he's interesting. I like that he's young. I like that he's offensive minded, but at the end of the day, I think, you know, we're looking at the same situation. You know, a lot of the previous Cowboys coaches haven't had a ton of playoff success, and I don't even think it's on them. I think it's on ownership. I think it's on some bad decisions. You know, I think back to the Trey Lance thing and how Jerry didn't even talk to anybody else before he made that decision. There's just a lot of things that make ownership really tough, and I think Jerry Jones has done it again. Probably hired another yes man, and the Cowboys are just going to stay stagnant. Very good. A lot of big names. You know, they can re-sign them, but just not good enough to reach the top. And I think that's going to be the same case of Brian Schottenheimer.